लाजिम है कि हम भी देखेंगे वो दिन के जिसका वादा है जो लोहे अज़ल में लिखा है। बस नाम रहेगा अल्लाह का, जो गायब भी है हाजिर भी, जो मंजर भी है नाजिर भी। उठेगा अनल हक का नारा, जो मैं भी हूँ तुम भी हो, और राज करेगी खल्क़ खुदा, जो मैं भी हूँ और तुम भी हो। हम देखेंगे, लाजिम है कि हम भी देखेंगे।
What does it mean to be a Muslim in contemporary India?
At a moment when modern nationalism wishes to deny not just Muslims but everyone the agency of free thinking.
Are Indian Muslims agents, victims, or believers?
One reason that we have lost that is because of this idea that religion is backwards. Religion keeps people from critical thinking.
Are matters of faith inconsequential to politics? If not, then how can we simultaneously explore the ethical and the political dimensions of the lives of Indian Muslims? Can exploring the anthropology of Islam provide an answer to these questions? Welcome to Haqq, a podcast on Islamic studies where we try to make the Islamic tradition interact with secular forms of knowledge and where we explore questions of politics, theology, and philosophy through an Islamic lens. In today's conversation with Dr. Anand Vivek Taneja, we'll be drawing upon the anthropology of Islam to understand how Indian Muslims engage with Islam as a discursive tradition within the context of contemporary Indian politics. Our aim is to understand how Indian Muslims have expressed notions of selfhood and faith, and how their religiosity and engagement with politics has transformed in the age of Hindu nationalism. All right, Dr. Taneja, welcome to Haqq. So, as you know, today we are going to unpack what Talal Asad meant when he said that Islam is a discursive tradition, and we'll try to see how we can use that to help make sense of the everyday lives of Muslims in contemporary India. And I mean, when we talk about Islam being a discursive tradition, this is something that might seem complicated to people who are not familiar with anthropology or religious studies more specifically. So our aim here today is to be able to unpack this in a manner, or rather in a language that would be accessible to people who may not necessarily be engaging with academia, but who may nevertheless be interested in, or who may in fact have a lot to contribute to some of the ideas that we'll explore here today. But before we do that, it would be great if you could tell our listeners a bit about yourself, as in what led you to becoming a scholar interested in anthropology, religion, and Muslims more particularly.
Okay. So, hello everyone. My name is Anand Taneja. I am an anthropologist, and I teach in the Department of Religious Studies at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, in the United States. So, how did I become an anthropologist? So, I am someone who has close connections to Lucknow. I grew up in Lucknow and then moved to Delhi for college. So, I'm someone who, to use a term that's somewhat not in favor these days, I feel that I grew up in what is called the Ganga Jamni Tehzeeb. So for me, Islam was not something. Islam and Muslims were actually very familiar to me because I grew up with Muslim neighbors, Muslim schoolmates, Muslim friends. So it never felt like something alien or foreign or distant. And then, of course, the politics of the country started changing, especially after the demolition of the Babri Masjid in 1992. And growing up in Lucknow, that's both geographically and culturally very close. When I moved to Delhi, I became very intrigued by the monuments of Delhi. And I was doing a major in history or history honors in college. So those interests coincided because in Delhi, especially if you're wandering around South Delhi, you can be next to a mall and suddenly you have this amazing 16th century monument, which people don't know anything about. So I became intrigued by the monuments and history of Delhi. And once you become intrigued by the monuments and history of Delhi, you kind of have to engage with Islam, because these are, Delhi was a city that was the center of Islamic rule in India for approximately 800 years. And the built heritage is full of that. And that led me to an engagement with Islam and with Tasawwuf. And one of the more intriguing places I found in my time in Delhi was Firoz Shah Kotla, which, is a monument. It's the ruins of a 14th century palace. But it is also in contemporary Delhi a dargah, in which the saints are not, the saints are jinnat, right? They're genies. And trying to think about this place from lenses other than the easy lens of superstition, trying to think what is it about, the specificity of the jinn as figures of memory or as figures of other temporality, and what that might have to do with the life of a post-partition city where much of the past there's been an attempt at the erasure of much of the past. That led me to the work on my dissertation, which ultimately led to my first book, Genealogy, Time, Islam, and Ecological Thought in the Medieval Ruins of Delhi, where I did have an engagement with the work of Talal Asad, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and his idea of the discursive tradition. And now currently, as an anthropologist who's interested in Delhi and Islam, I also work with a lot of Urdu literature. I also try to think about the what is called the Muslimness of Indian popular culture, particularly Bombay cinema. And all of those are elements in my first book, but those also, in a sense, prepared the ground for the work I'm doing right now, which is to think about, what I'm trying to write a book right now on Indian Muslim poetry, ethics, and politics in the age of Hindu nationalism. This is based largely on research I did in 2018, 2019, and 2020. I was in Delhi. I went back to Delhi this summer, but before that, because of the pandemic lockdowns, I was in Delhi just before the lockdowns, right around the time of the Northeast Delhi riots, while the Shaheen Bagh protest was still going on. Anyway, I think that's enough of an introduction. That's a rather long introduction to me and my work, but we can take it from there. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Taneja, for that interesting introduction. And so we'll move to Talal Asad in a bit and his concept of discursive tradition, which basically emerged out of his attempt to answer the question of what an anthropology of Islam might look like. But before we do that, for our listeners here, it would be great if you could explain briefly what anthropology really is and why you think it is important for us to study religion and religious communities per se through an anthropological lens.
That's a very profound question. Let me answer. Anthropology is the study of anthropos, right, of man. I guess we can say it is a study of what it means to be a human. Now, if we translate anthropology into Urdu and Farsi, to closely related, but not close to related, but different languages, we get two different meanings of anthropology. And this I'm telling out of a conversation with a poet. And so this is in the world of discourse, right? It's guftagu, it's dialogue. And it is part of the discursive tradition because we are dealing with central terms in the Islamic world. So in Urdu, anthropology is called bashariyat, right? The study of bashar. In Farsi, anthropology is translated as insan shinasi, recognizing the human, recognizing the insan. Now, if we ask ourselves if there is a difference between bashar and insan and anthropos, then if we study humanity so when I was talking about these terms with a respected Urdu poet of our time, we said, देखिए, ये बशर और इंसान का फर्क तो ये गालिब ने शुरू किया है, right? बस के दुश्वार है हर काम का आसान होना, आदमी को भी मयस्सर नहीं इंसान होना. So to be an insan in this typology, in our inherited Islamic vocabulary, and this we can trace back to, for example, the Surah Al-Insan in the Quran, is a very elevated status. It is the status of human perfectibility. So, आदमी को भी मयस्सर नहीं, आदमी को भी मयस्सर नहीं, इंसान होना. So when we study anthropos, when we study man, are we studying us in our failings, in our corruptibility, in our fallen state as being humans? Or are we studying the possibility of human perfectibility, of being better than who we are? In one sense, I find that a lot of anthropology study, and I think both of those things are important to anthropology, to study the ways in which we as humans are sometimes not up to our moral standards, or the compromises we make, or the things we do to exist in the world. But I also find it equally interesting and fascinating, and I think my work is more aligned with the Insan Shinasi sense of anthropology, in which, for example, in my first book, I studied how being at dargahs was really ethically and morally transformative for people, right? That when we talk about healing at dargahs, it is actually about, in a sense, what we could call, using an anthropological vocabulary, ethical self-fashioning, transforming yourself and your relation to the world in order to bring some kind of peace and satisfaction, and a kind of reworking of relations in the world. And if we look at the ways in which, in the past few years, in the face of some awful stuff that's been hurled at Indian Muslims, right? We can talk about lynchings, we can talk about everyday discrimination, we can talk about, government's legislation, which is out and out exclusionary. All of these things are happening. And yet the collective Muslim response has been one of sabr, of patience, of beauty, of creativity, of coming up with new forms of protest, of new styles of poetry. Again, this is not a very coherent answer, but what does it mean to be an anthropologist? I mean, it means to study humans. It means to study how we can rise to a more elevated level of being human, of being insan.
Thank you so much for answering that really comprehensively. Now, let us move to anthropology and Islam, or rather anthropology of Islam. So I would begin by Edward Said, because he's someone whose arguments a lot of people are already familiar with. So when Said put forward his critique of Orientalist scholarship, and he argued that it is wrong to present Islam and Muslims as monolithic categories that have remained unchanged across cultures and geographies. And his argument was basically an attempt to disrupt the image of Muslims as violent, barbaric, and fanatical, which had also emerged out of Muslims, or rather Islam, being reduced to a trans-historical and a trans-cultural entity. And to a certain extent, in line with Said's criticism, many anthropologists began to present Islam as something that does not have an essential core. So they argued that, there are so many linguistic, cultural, sectarian, and regional differences among Muslims. So there's really no point in looking for an anthropology of Islam. Rather, the enterprise itself is fruitless. So instead, you should look at Muslims, because there is no Islam as such. There are just Muslims and different kinds of Muslims. And therefore, their focus was more on the realm of culture and, the culture of Muslim societies, etc. And this is where Talal Asad intervenes, and he argues that instead of saying that there are a variety of Islams, you should see Islam as a discursive tradition. So he acknowledges that there are a lot of disagreements and debates going on among Muslims, but he says that in order for those disagreements to happen and sustain over such a long period of time, there has to be a shared framework. And he says that tradition does not necessarily mean that it is something that has been passed down from generations to generations unchanged. Rather, tradition can also be open to new sets of challenges and questions and changes, right? So, I mean, there are people who try to put boundaries on what is Islamic and what is not Islamic, and then you have people who try to push those boundaries, and all of that happens within the tradition. And if we come across a point of view that is not part of the mainstream Islamic stance on something, then that does not mean that it is necessarily outside of the Islamic tradition. It is also within the tradition, because it is trying to interpret Quran and the message of the Prophet in its own way. So Talal Asad argues that it's not like there are different Islams, it's just that there are different ways of interpreting and engaging with the Quran and the Sunnah, the Prophet, right? So now let us move to Indian Muslims. So my question to you is that how do you think have Indian Muslims employed faith and the religious tradition to navigate the realities, the socio-political realities of contemporary India and all those experiences of marginalization and discrimination that it brings along with itself?
Yeah, thank you for that beautiful summary of what Asad is saying. So let me add to that. I think, when Asad talks about Islam as a discursive tradition, right, where the dialogue, where as you exactly said, right, that ultimately it is the sources about which all Muslims agree to disagree, as it were, are the Quran and the Sunnah, right? Like those are the central terms, and then around that, those are the central texts, and then around that we can choose, we can have differences of interpretation and emphasis on those, but that the core remains the same. Now, to simply answer your question, one simple way to look at how Muslims in this current time have been navigating, the halat is a central Islamic virtue, which is sabr. So if you listen to, as I did, if you listen to the khutbat in various masajid in Delhi and elsewhere, again and again in these days, the emphasis is on sabr, right? Again and again, the stories that are told from the Sunnah of the Prophet, peace be upon him, are about, how the Prophet responded when, for example, there was the woman who used to throw garbage on him, right? And but one day the woman didn't throw garbage on him, and instead of so he asked, "Oh, is she all right? Right?" So this idea of taking care even of a neighbor who's hostile to you, or being concerned even about someone who's being hostile to you because they are your neighbor, is linked to the prophetic tradition. Now, does that have something to say about what Muslims are dealing with right now? Of course it does. So there is that way in which, we could talk about what is easily recognized as the mainstream Islamic discursive tradition, which is linked to the Quran and the Sunnah and the ulama, the people who are authorized to speak about Islam, and the khutbah they are giving. That is, of course, telling Muslims to, engage in sabr at this time. And that is very much a mainstream response. What I want to kind of expand that a little more. So I think Asad was absolutely brilliant in making the discursive tradition of Islam very central to how we do the anthropology of Islam. And it's led to some incredible work, right? For example, Sabah Mahmood's Politics of Piety, for example, and how cultivating the central Islamic virtue of modesty or haya is actually agentive, right? So she is the one who makes us think about the agency of women who choose to put on hijab instead of seeing the hijab as a sign of oppression. Asad's emphasis on the discursive tradition has led to some path-breaking works in the anthropology of Islam. However, it really opens up the question of what is the discursive tradition, right? What constitutes it? In the mainstream anthropology of Islam, the emphasis has been on the Quran and the Sunnah, as it should, right? Of course, they are central. But there are other aspects, and this is my belief through my engagement with Islam and Muslims in India, that there is a larger field of discourse and dialogue, which of course, does not exclude Quran and Sunnah, but also includes things like poetry, shairi, right? And the reason I say this is that I found that a lot of the conversation that was happening about, the current condition among Muslims of different kinds, right? Shias and Sunnis, or people across Maslaks, Deobandi or Barelvi, or people who are more secular / liberal, and people who are more, madhabi, more religious. Between all of them, the common language of discourse was the ways in which you express your interior states, but also express how you are to deal with the situation was poetry. Shairi was the common language of discourse which both expressed how you were feeling, but also how you were supposed to respond to the process. I mean, let's just think about, to give the most obvious example, in the protests and of course, poetry expands, beyond Muslims to people who understand Hindustani Urdu, right? So it's a much wider world of discourse. Let us think of the central song of the anti-CAA protests, Faiz Ahmed Faiz, Hum Dekhenge, right? And Faiz Ahmed Faiz, if you look at the actual printed text of the poem is not called Hum Dekhenge, the Nazm, it's called, the title is, and I'm going to, my Arabic is not great, so I'll probably mess this up, but Wabaka Wajjahu Rabbika, the face of your Lord endures forever. It's a verse from the Quran, or it's a phrase of a verse from the Quran. So the poem Hum Dekhenge, and it is the poem, the Nazm is full of Quranic imagery, right? वो दिन के जिसका वादा था, the day that was promised, जो लौहे अज़ल में लिखा था, and then the ways in which it describes, the response to a moment of oppression is totally drawing on the Quran, and that becomes the central song of the anti-CAA protests, used by Muslims, of course, but also many, many non-Muslims. I'm thinking, for example, of the IIT protests, which were also part of the anti-CAA, which were largely non-Muslim, and all else. So why is it that, poetry becomes so central to expressing a certain form of dissent, but in a completely Islamic language? That is something that I think, to understand, the Indian Muslim response to the current moment, we need to expand the discursive tradition, not just to think with the Quran and the Sunnah, but also to think with poetry and the ways in which the poetry carries forward traditions of ethical response to various issues.
Yeah, so this reminds me of one of your articles on Ghalib, wherein you mentioned that a lot of people nowadays in North India are trying to reclaim Ghalib as an authoritative Islamic figure rather than present him as someone who was completely irreligious. So, I want to discuss two things with you here. What do you think of the tendency to secularize the poetry of people like Ghalib and even Faiz, for that matter? A lot of people tend to ignore the religious connotations of the poem Hum Dekhenge. It is giving direct references to the Day of Judgment, but it has to a very large extent been secularized. Whether Faiz himself was a religious person or not is a different matter, but we cannot ignore the fact that some of his poetry is deeply religious and uses Quranic imagery. So, even with Ghalib, we tend to romanticize him a lot when he talks about drinking wine and committing sins and criticizing mullahs. So in this sense, there is a kind of dichotomy that is created between wherein on the one hand you have a rigid fundamentalist Islam, and on the other hand you have quote-unquote cool Muslims like Ghalib who are in a way anti-Islam. This is not who Ghalib was, but that is how he's presented. My question to you is that when you see Ghalib and Faiz being presented in the manner I described, what does that say about the way leftists and liberals perceive Islam and Muslims? And secondly, when you talk about Ghalib being reclaimed as an authoritative Islamic figure, what does that say about Islam being a discursive tradition?
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. That's a wonderful question, and I hope I can do it justice. So I think with Ghalib, I'm just thinking as you were talking, I think figures like Faiz and Ghalib, they might not be religious in our conventional sense, but they were believers, right? There is no question about that. And I think that is central, right? That I'll hold that fact, that there is no question about the belief in Tawheed of either Ghalib or Faiz. And I'll leave that aside. I'll start with an anecdote of Ghalib, right, which begins the very famous program on him on Doordarshan, which I grew up watching, right, in the 1980s. So it literally starts with Ghalib not being able to enter a masjid at the end of his life. But if you read Ghalib's letters and, his biography by Ralph Russell, Ghalib used to go to the masjid. He may not have gone to pray. He used to go to listen to the Tarawih prayers, right? Because he loved the recitation of the Quran. So the idea that Ghalib never went into a masjid, why is this part of popular culture? I think it is because of, as you said, there is this kind of secular leftist idea, which we have all inherited in some measure, that you can't be religious, that religion is backwards. You can't be religious, you can't be a believer and a free thinker, right? So we know about Ghalib that he was immensely devoted to Maula Ali, right? We know that he, was deeply interested in matters of tasawwuf. And he used to say, right, ye misail tasawwuf, ye tera kalam, ye tera bayan Ghalib, tujhe hum wali samajhte jo na bada khar hota, right? So he says, I could have been a saint, but I drink wine, right? There is a reason that I'm not of the elevated status of a saint, because, I drink wine. I've gotten myself out of the game, in certain sense. So Ghalib, and he calls himself an Azad thinker, right? Right. The phrase, I think one thing to think about is the ways in which the idea of Azad Khayali, or free thinking, the idea of critique as being an internal part of religious life, or being the critical edge of the discursive tradition of Islam rather than being outside of it, is something that Ghalib embodies. Now, one reason that we have lost that is because of this idea, which is an idea that we get, which is an inheritance of the Enlightenment, right? That religion is backwards. Religion keeps people from critical thinking. It doesn't have to. I think critical thinking is a part of religion, and Ghalib and poets in general embody that, right? The critical edge of tradition. And the other is that that's had a response even among Muslims, though to a lesser extent, right? Because poetry has such high value among Muslims that the idea that poetry is entirely out of Islam is still a little harder to swallow. But that exists as a kind of tradition. So, because poetry is linked to, to forms of, to ilham, to revelation, right? So so there is that element of divinity still within poetry that hasn't entirely gone away. So, all right, what was I? Sorry, I lost my track of that. But yeah, so I think if we look at someone like Faiz Ghalib, Faiz writes, so Ghalib, in his time is, he embodies a certain kind of being Muslim, right? Where you can be a believer, where you can deal with the complexities of tasawwuf and have a complicated relationship to the religion, right? And that at this moment, that being reclaimed, right? As I talk about in that article that you mentioned, that being reclaimed at this moment tells us that people, at a moment when Hindu nationalism wants a certain kind of conformity, at that time, to reclaim a figure who can be a figure of freedom, of critical thinking, of human freedom, who can also be very much a religious self, is a challenge to the conformity that modern nationalism demands of us, right? Ghalib says, "Bandagi mein bhi wo azada o khushbi hai ki hum ulte fir aaye dare Kaaba agar wa na hua." Right? I might have misquoted that slightly, but right, the idea that even in servitude, bandagi is when you are in submission, right? When you are in Islam, even in submission, we are so free and self-regarding that we turn back from the Kaaba if the door was not open. I mean, what do you do with that verse, right? How do you think with that? That figure of free thinking as something that needs to be reclaimed as a possibility of human freedom, as a traditional possibility of human freedom that is linked to the Islamic tradition and not outside of it, at a moment when modern nationalism wishes to deny not just Muslims but everyone the agency of free thinking. I think that's a remarkable move. Yeah, and I'll just say that about Faiz, right? When Faiz wrote his nazm that we popularly know as Hum Dekhenge, that was also, he was like, all right, Zia al-Haq is claiming the Islamic State. Well, here is an Islamic response to the Islamic State which says no. Right? So, yeah.
Yeah, so I'll now talk about your article, Hindustan is a Dream, Urdu Poetry and the Political Theology of Intimacy. So there you mentioned that poetry has long been a very important form of discourse for the Islamic tradition. And then you go on to talk about how Urdu poetry nowadays in India has become very popular among the Muslim youth, especially in this rising climate of Islamophobia. So I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about the relevance of Urdu to the relevance of poetry to the Islamic tradition, and then go on to more specifically talk about how Urdu poetry has played a role in shaping the religiosity and the resistance of Muslims in India nowadays.
So poetry was one of the most respected art forms in pre-Islamic Arabia, right? And that continues to be the form after Islam, right? But in the sense that the inspirational figure for the poet changes from the jinnat to being the same angelic inspiration, obviously not to the same degree, but as was revealed to the Prophet, right? And ilham remains a possibility of revelation. Shahab Ahmad talks about this in much detail in his book, What is Islam, right? Because he is really interested in kind of opening up the discursive tradition of Islam to poetry, which he says is, has a much wider kind of circulatory life than the Quran and the Sunnah. So, I would just direct people to read Shahab Ahmad and What is Islam to think about how poetry continues to have a life, or has a life which is linked to revelation, right? We can think of the importance in the Persian-speaking world of the divan of Hafiz, right, who's known as the Lisan al-Ghaib, the tongue of the unseen, right, that the unseen is still speaking through the tongue of the poet. We can think of the importance of Maulana Rum. And then in the Urdu tradition, I can say, I'll quickly quote a sher that a figure of Islamic authority, a sheikh of a Sufi Khanka, who's a very learned man, spoke to me when I was talking to him about the current political moment. He quoted a sher from the poet Majru Sultanpuri. Said, "Mujhse kaha Jibreel Junoo ne, ye bhi wahi ilahi hai. Mazhab to bas mazhab dil hai, baki sab gumrahi hai." Then he said, where I'm quoting the sher, log kahenge ki inhone Jibreel Ami ko Jibreel Junoo kyun kaha, right? So there are a lot of things happening in the sher, right? So first of all, the poet is saying that the Gabriel of madness, Jibreel Junoo, is speaking to him, right? The same Gabriel who brought inspiration to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Except that this is not the Jibreel Amin, the resourceful, the truthful Jibreel, but Jibreel Junoo, the Gabriel of madness. Ye bhi wahi ilahi hai. This too is divine revelation, right? So the poet is claiming divine revelation. Mazhab to bas mazhab dil hai, baki sab gumrahi hai. That the true religion is the religion of the heart. Now, everything else is losing the way. I'm still trying to unpack the complexity of this, but it really makes me think about what the tradition means, right? Why is it that the Gabriel of madness speaks to the poet? The Sheikh at the end of this said, when he answered the question that he asked, why Jibreel Amin ko Jibreel Junoo kyun kaha hai? Kyunki Junoon to mohabbat ki intaha hai. Junoon, madness, is the kind of final stage or the intaha of love. Now he gave me this share as an answer to a question about contemporary politics, which tells you something, right? This was a political share. And what is the primacy of Junoon, right? If we think of Majnoon, right? Majnun, who's a central figure in the Islamic poetic tradition. Majnu loves Layla in spite of all obstacles. Can we interpret that? One very simple interpretation of that would be that to express love, to express openness in the face of all kinds of discrimination is a form of junoon, is a form of madness. It doesn't make reasonable sense, but that is, that is truly the most ethical thing you can do. That is what makes you an insan, right? I'm thinking as I'm speaking of the expressions of love and freedom and openness that I saw at Shaheen Bagh in the face of the discriminatory legislation of the CAA, in the face of the Delhi police, brutalizing the Jamia campus. The discourse that emerged in the face of that was that of love. In some sense, we can think of Junoon, Majnoon. What does that have to do with the prophet, with the Islamic tradition? It's central. It is not that different from the Prophet and the companions of the Prophet persisting in the face of all of the discrimination they had to face. And I'm reminded of a sher by Javed Mushiri, who's a Delhi poet, which takes the image of Majnun. And I might be misquoting this slightly, but he says, रक्स में मसरूफ रहना आस के थमने तलक वुस्सते सहरा खुलेगी देख वीराने के बाद. Stay busy in dancing, right? Like dancing like a madman till the end of hope. The wussate sahra, the expanse of the desert, of the wilderness, will open after the virana, after the desolation, right? So what are the ways in which poetry holds open and expands the possibilities, the wusat of the discursive tradition of Islam? So there are ways in which this is kind of gesturing towards a widened horizon of possibilities, but only through the junoon of love, right, in the face of things. And I think, again, like to a more common example of how Indian Muslim poetry holds open contains political theology within it is Rahat Indori's famous sher, right? Sabhi ka khoon hai shamil yahan ki mitti mein, kisi ke baap ka Hindustan thodi hai. Right? So the idea that everyone's blood is mingled in the soil, Hindustan doesn't belong to anyone's father, seems like a very throwaway verse, but it's actually deeply engaged with, for example, the Deobandi theological position that, that nationality or belonging is made, qawmiyat is made from awtan, right, from homelands, from watan, rather than from mazhab, right, from religion, which is why there was a Deobandi pushback against the idea of Muslim separatism, for example. And at this point against Hindu nationalism, right, kisi ke baap ka Hindustan thodi. And it also carries with it the sense of, right, that if we look at who is embedded in the blood in the soil here, it is, Muslims are buried in the soil, right? They're literally part of the soil. So all of these ideas get contained within those two lines of poetry, right? And so, poetry, especially shairi, ghazal shairi, you'll often hear people saying "gagar mein sagar," right? Like that you're containing a sea within a small pot, and that really holds true in certain ways for the ways in which Urdu poetry works in conveying these theological and ethical ideas.
Right. So since you mentioned sabr and how it is being employed by Muslims to deal with this current situation, I wanted to discuss with you the tendency to, see faith as some sort of a false consciousness or a kind of illusion, right? So, if you come across Muslims if you come across a Muslim who is in a state of despair, not knowing what to do, they will usually invoke the concept of tawakkul, which basically about trust in Allah. And nowadays you see people talking about divine justice and sabr, etc. So like back in 2019, 2020, I used to be someone who would say that, I mean, divine justice and all is great, but Allah is going to help you only when your trust in Him is accompanied by some sort of action on your part. And by action, I largely meant, being involved with the politics of the day in some shape or form and resisting it. But now I realize that it may not always be possible for people to actively engage with politics, and it may not always be feasible. And sometimes you may just have to leave things to the divine plan, which is what I see a lot of Muslims around me doing nowadays. And now I see it as their way of resisting. So, I mean, resistance is not just the anti-CA movement and people shouting slogans on the streets, but it can also happen within their homes. It can happen in their salah, in their duas. So, I mean, and I don't see this as a kind of false consciousness wherein they are clinging on to religion, even though it has nothing substantial to offer. I mean, if my faith is the reason why I am being discriminated against and hated, then me clinging on to that faith is also an act of dissent, an act of resistance, right? So what I wanted to ask you was whether you have come across this mode of resistance during your fieldwork in India, and what do you make of it? I mean, it is not political in the conventional sense, but it is also, a kind of normative, ethical project, which is in some ways political as well.
Thank you. I think I would just change the terms of your question, right? From one of resistance to one of agency, right? Because we tend to think of agency only as resistance, and this is the so to talk about Sabah Mahmood again, who talks in the Politics of Piety about where she has this very complicated engagement with feminism. She says that in feminism we just mostly talk about domination and resistance, and we can't think of agency in any other mode than of resistance. But what about working on the self, right? What about cultivating yourself to be a self who is in line with what a pious Islamic subjectivity might be? Is that not a form of agency? And her answer is unequivocally yes. We just need to recognize that as a form of agency, and we need to open up the anthropology in general, and not just the anthropology of Islam, to be able to engage with forms of agency that do not look like, domination versus resistance. And, what you're saying, of course, there's been a big, from what I've observed, of course, people have been more politicized in the conventional sense by what is happening in India. But also, politicization in the conventional sense also comes with a great deal of risk, especially if you're a Muslim, right? I know so many activists who are in jail at this point, and in UP they're demolishing houses and everything, right? It's but there is also, along with the politicization, there is a general move towards the phrase that I've often heard is bedari, right? Awakening. Now, awakening is not, obviously it is political, right? That there is a growing political consciousness, but there is also a move towards, for example, education. Right. So people are like, we're just going to educate our children. We're going to educate ourselves because one way of self-betterment is through education. Right. And then, of course, this is what I haven't seen, but what you are alerting me to, and I would love to talk with you more about, is the turning towards God. Right. That turning towards the internal, the cultivation of the self, that what I can do is act upon the self to make myself a more pious subject, which, we see in Egypt with the piety movement that Sabah Mahmood is talking about. And I'm not surprised that is what you're seeing right now. Because, of course, that is a huge ethical normative goal. And what else, why would you not do that, right? So, yeah. And I think especially in the pandemic, a lot of people turned inwards. That's certainly true for the United States, so I'm sure that's also true for India. So,
right. So now let us go back to Talal Asad for a bit. I mean, and his Talal Asad and his insistence on giving equal weightage to both intellectual and embodied tradition.
Mhm.
So right. So when we think of discursive tradition or Islam as a discursive tradition, we perceive it mainly in terms of debates and discussions and controversies happening within the scriptural sphere among Islamic scholars. And Asad's argument was that discursive tradition is as much about the everyday lived realities of Muslims as it is about what goes on in the scholarly world. And this emphasis on embodiment is something that he acquired from his mother. He often talks about it, and this is something I personally find very beautiful. He says that while his father's approach to religion and Islam was intellectual, for his mother, religion was more like a way of being. It was an embodied condition of being. So she used to recite Quran and offer her 5 daily prayers, and they were a very essential part of her everyday life. So her engagement with religion was not intellectual, it was more emotional and physical, wherein she was involved in piety through all her senses and through her body and soul. Whereas for his father, Muhammad Asad, religion was largely an intellectual enterprise. So this is what led to Asad realizing that the everyday and the ordinary aspect of the way we practice religiosity is as important as intellectuality in seeing Islam as a discursive tradition. So in that sense, there is often a dichotomy that is created between a fundamentalist, rigid, scholarly Islam on the one hand, and on the other hand, you have a more flexible and a more tolerant lived Islam or a local Islam, right? Wherein the former is presented as traditional and fundamentalist, and the latter is more untraditional, unconventional, and more secular and cultural. So, in that sense, what would your response be to people who say that Indian Islam is somehow different from Islam per se or Islam in other parts of the world? And the sense in which they make this claim is that Islam is, inherently, or it is largely exclusionary and intolerant, but Indian Islam, due to its inflection with Hinduism and the syncretic culture of India, has somehow been made much more secular and much more tolerant. And therefore, Indian Muslims are a more acceptable variety of species that are otherwise violent and exclusionary. So, how fair do you think that assumption is? And
no, I don't think it's fair, right? But if we look at the Muslim world pre-1948, right, pre-Second World War, for example, we look not just at India, but if we look at India is not the only place where Muslims live with religious diversity, right? Especially before the Second World War. If you look at Iraq with a huge population of Iraqi Jews, right? For example, if you look at Palestine, where pre-48 Palestine, there's Christians, Muslims, Jews. Yemen, right? Egypt, Copts, Muslims. So the idea that only in India are Muslims uniquely tolerant is Indonesia, for example, is historically inaccurate, right? So Muslims have, from the inception of Islam, lived with religious diversity. Religious diversity is mentioned in the Quran, right? The Jews, the Christians, the Sabians, all of these will, find all of the good ones among them will, again, misquoting, but this is from the Surah Al-Baqarah, right? That the Jews, Christians, and Sabians are all, and the Sabians that remain mysterious, are all mentioned as communities that will find salvation, right? So, given that, and given the historical presence of multiplicity of religions within a very wide swath of the Islamic world, the idea that Muslims in India are uniquely tolerant is wrong. And the idea that Muslims are uniquely tolerant only because they are kind of somehow diluted with Hinduism is also wrong. What we can say is that if we look at the Islamic discursive tradition, right, the discourse, the dialogue, the intellectual tradition, that in India had to deal with the presence of a very large number of non-Muslims, right? And had to engage with that. at an intellectual level, okay, now what do we do with this, right? So that intellectual engagement you see from, to take two figures, see Al-Biruni and Al-Hind writing about, okay, they seem to be worshipping idols, but the elite among them are really monotheists, right? So that's Al-Biruni and Al-Hind, right, which is the moment of Mahmud Ghaznavi, right, coming into the subcontinent, right? So at that moment of what is remembered in Indian historiography as like violence and destruction is also this moment of deep engagement with the other. And then the second figure is Dara Shikoh, right, intellectually, who's looking at the Upanishads and using them to understand the Quran. Now, that is the intellectual tradition that is happening as an engagement with the presence of the other. That is an Islamic engagement, which is going back to the Quran and the Sunnah, right, to make meaning. Does that have an embodied life? Of course it does. We see the embodied life of that tradition in, for example, the culture of dargahs in India, where religious diversity is palpable, is present. So I don't think there's a dichotomy. I think what the problem is that, again, and this is also a problem in the way that Asad's work has been read, where the discursive tradition gets reduced to intellectual debates, and the Quran and the Sunnah is interpreted by certain exclusionary trends within Islam rather than this kind of broader trend of religious diversity, right? So it's a very short-sighted reading of what the discursive tradition actually is, which Asad in his later work, as you're pointing out, opens up, right, through this question of embodiment. And that embodiment, those intellectual debates continue to have a contemporary life. If you look at the ways in which people practiced openness and diversity in Shaheen Bagh, these are not people who are, especially the women, these are not people who are, ulema. But if they are very much Muslims, they're very much committed to living pious Muslim lives. They created a space of radical openness where everyone was welcome. I think Akil Bilgrami said something really wonderful in his initial response to what was happening in India, where he said, these people are bringing together the pluralist traditions of India, of Indian Islam, right, with the defense of the constitution in a way that Nehru, Gandhi, and Maulana Azad couldn't do. And that is because that embodied tradition, the intellectual life of the tradition lives on in embodied life. I don't think there's a dichotomy between the two. And I think if there is something special about Indian Islam, is just that there's been a very long intellectual discursive tradition of dealing with the other, which continues to be relevant in India because of the continued presence of religious diversity. Whereas in other parts of the world, it's been forgotten because of, the ways in which, say, it's convenient to forget it, right? Because there is not that presence of religious minorities at the same level anymore. But that's a very modern phenomenon, right?
Right. So what do you think are some of the existing gaps in vis-a-vis the study of Indian Muslims in academia and in anthropology more generally?
I mean, there are huge gaps. I'm thinking of the work of Sayyid Zahir Hussain Jafri, SHZ Jafri, in the history department at Delhi University. He talks about 1857 being a kind of cataclysmic moment where we kind of lose the whole epistemological tradition of pre-modern South Asia just gets lost in a sense. And we don't really have people who are working to recover that, right? So you have people who study Arabic and Persian, work on the pre-modern. You have people who maybe can read Urdu, who work on the contemporary. A lot of people don't. So we need to create ways in which we can bring the classical languages, Arabic, Persian, and Sanskrit, right? Because let us not forget there's a huge Muslim engagement with Sanskrit traditions as well. So we need a way to recover the ways in which the classical traditions, Arabic, Persian, and Sanskrit, were engaged with by Muslim scholars with the contemporary. And we need to bridge that with the study of contemporary Islam as it is lived and practiced in India. Because once we do that bridging, once we bring those two things together, then we are going to see continuities and persistences rather than discontinuities. Right?
Absolutely. And I think nowadays, Muslimness has been reduced to a very politicized and victimized way of being, and what gets lost in the process is, all those agonies and anxieties, fears, resentments, attachments that make life coherent for us here. And I think this is where the intervention of scholars like you becomes extremely important, because you bring to light the aspects of our lives that are seemingly quote unquote unimportant, but that nevertheless make us who we are. So thank you so much for the work that you do, and I wish you all the best for your future endeavors. And so before I let you go, who are some of the scholars that you would like to recommend as far as anthropology of religion is concerned generally, and then more particularly Indian Muslims and the anthropology of Islam vis-a-vis India?
All right. So one of the best books in the anthropology of Islam, which I highly recommend that everyone read, is Amira Mittermeier's Dreams That Matter, which again thinks about dreams as a central part of the Islamic experience and what to do with that and discourse. In the anthropology of Islam, one of my favorite books, which I think is it's not necessarily a book of anthropology, it's a book of Islamic studies, is Shahab Ahmad's What is Islam? Because he holds open, again, he's someone who actually operates very much within the discursive tradition of Indian Islam, because he thinks through poetry. I think he uses the शेर किसी को अपने अमल का हिसाब क्या देते, सवाल सारे गलत थे, जवाब क्या देते. I think this is Munir Niazi's. He uses that as a central intellectual linchpin to turn around the whole question of what the discursive tradition is and what we should study. And he's really deeply engaged with, South Asian texts and traditions. A lot of the more recent work of Veena Das, particularly a chapter by her called The Amil and the Anthropologist. I highly recommend reading that, and just a lot of her work. And I'll say that for those are the things that come to mind off the top of my head. Again, not anthropology, but Shankar Nair's book, Translating Wisdom, which is looking at the engagement of Muslim intellectuals with Sanskrit texts, would be very much worth a read. Joyce Flukiger's In Amma's Healing Room, Carla Bellamy's book on healing in Jaura Sharif, what is it called? Hussain Tegri in Jaura. Yeah, those are the things that I can think of. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Taneja, for coming here today and for answering all of my questions very comprehensively. It was very beneficial for me as well, and I hope our listeners also enjoyed the conversation. So thank you so much.